Bonsoir. Welcome, dreamers. It is I, Napoleon Bonaparte. Perhaps you have heard my name carried by history. Perhaps you imagine me upon a battlefield, cloaked in smoke and glory. But tonight, I do not come to you as a general, nor as an emperor, but as a storyteller. Lay down your burdens, rest your head upon the pillow, and close your weary eyes. For this night I shall tell you the story of my life. Not in the thunder of cannons or the clash of sabers, but in a quiet voice, one fit to carry you gently into sleep. The tale begins not in Paris, not upon some grand stage of Europe, but on a small and rugged island, Corsica. The air there was sharp with the scent of the sea, the mountains dark and noble. My family was not rich, but proud of our Corsican roots, proud of the land that gave us strength. I was born in the summer of 1769 in the humble town of Ajaccio, a child, small, often serious, yet already with fire in my eyes. I remember the narrow streets, the sound of waves breaking upon the shore, and the voices of my brothers and sisters filling our home with both quarrels and laughter. My father, Carlo, was a man of ambition, and my mother, Letizia, was stern, strong, unyielding. She shaped me as much as any battlefield would in later years. But Corsica was not a land of ease. It was a place of struggle, where the old ways of independence clashed with the power of France. I grew up between these tensions, feeling the weight of both freedom and submission pressing upon me. Even as a boy, I dreamed of greatness, though I did not yet know what form it would take. At night, I would lie awake, staring at the stars above the island's sky, wondering if destiny had carved my name upon them. I was restless, eager, certain that I was meant for something beyond the hills and harbors of Corsica. And in those dreams, the seeds of ambition took root, seeds that would one day carry me far from that island shore. And so, my friends, as you drift gently into the folds of sleep, imagine a young boy walking along a moonlit coast, the waves whispering to him of a world yet to be conquered. That boy was I, and my journey was only beginning. The tides of fate soon carried me away from Corsica. At the age of 9, I left the warm shores of my island home and stepped into the world of France. It was a journey of both promise and pain. For though I went to learn, I also went to leave behind the familiar laughter of family, the mountains, and the sea that had cradled me. I was sent first to a school at Autun, where the French language wrapped itself around my tongue like a new garment, stiff, uncomfortable, but necessary. I struggled. My Corsican accent was heavy, my French awkward. The other boys, they laughed at me, mocked me for my roughness, for my island ways. I was alone, surrounded by those who thought themselves superior. Yet solitude became my companion, and ambition my shield. At Brienne, the military academy, I immersed myself not in play or chatter, but in books, in studies, in thought. History became my silent friend. I devoured the tales of Alexander, of Caesar, of Hannibal, and I whispered to myself, one day I too shall be remembered. The winters at Brienne were bitterly cold, the winds cutting through stone walls, but I walked them with a determination that no frost could freeze. I was not the tallest of boys, nor the most charming, but I carried within me something different, an unshakable will. I remember walking alone across the snowy courtyard, the sky gray above me, the sound of the other boys fading into the distance. In those quiet steps, I promised myself that one day I would prove them all wrong. That one day, the world that laughed at me would come to bow before me. Still, I was young, and often I felt the ache of loneliness. The nights were long and the silence heavy. Yet as I lay in my narrow bed, I would close my eyes and let my mind drift beyond the academy walls, beyond France itself to battlefields of my imagination, where my name carried weight, where soldiers followed me, where nations trembled. And so, as you rest now beneath your own blanket of night, imagine me a boy far from home, small in stature but vast in dreams, already listening to the quiet whisper of destiny. When my years at Brienne drew to a close, I was but 16, thin and serious. more often with a book in hand than a sword. Yet I was ready to climb further. The next step in my path led me to the very heart of France, Paris. There I entered the École Militaire, the grand academy where the future officers of the nation were molded. Paris, a city of noise and light, a world apart from the quiet hills of Corsica and the stone walls of Brienne. The streets bustled with carriages, with voices rising in every corner, with the fragrance of bread from the bakeries and smoke curling from lanterns in the night. To many, Paris was dazzling, but to me it felt overwhelming, even suffocating. I carried with me the same burdens as before, my accent, my island roots, my air of being an outsider. Among polished young gentlemen, I was again the stranger, but I had grown accustomed to solitude, and I wore it now like a cloak. At École Militaire, I buried myself in my studies. Mathematics, artillery, fortifications. These were my obsessions. Where others found amusement in balls and banquets, I found it in geometry and strategy. I would spend hours tracing the lines of fortresses on parchment, calculating angles of fire, studying the old masters of war. The science of battle was a puzzle, and I delighted in solving it. The instructors noted my diligence, though perhaps they also found me severe, too stern for my years. I did not waste time in frivolities. I had no fortune to spend, no noble title to fall back upon. My path would be carved only through discipline, and discipline became my companion, as firm and unyielding as my own mother's voice in my memory. Paris itself was in turmoil. The city simmered with the discontent of the people, whispers of revolution growing louder each day. Bread was scarce, tempers flared, and the weight of injustice pressed upon the streets. Though I was but a student, I felt the shifting winds of history moving through the air, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. At night, when my lessons were done, I would sit at the window of my small room, gazing out over the city rooftops. The lamps flickered below, the Seine moved quietly in the dark, and I would let my mind drift. I imagined armies at my command, imagined the thunder of cannon rolling across the fields, imagined myself shaping the fate of nations. These were only dreams, but they gave warmth to my heart when loneliness pressed in. I graduated as a lieutenant of artillery in 1785, younger than most and eager to begin. Yet when the moment came, when I donned the uniform of an officer, it did not feel like the end of schooling, rather. It felt like the true beginning of my education. For the world outside the academy was restless, and soon it would call me into its storms. As you listen now, perhaps with your own eyes growing heavy, picture a young man of 16, small, pale, carrying more determination than strength. He walks through the grand gates of Paris, unnoticed among the crowds. Yet within him burns a quiet certainty. He does not yet know the scale of the road ahead, but he knows it is waiting. And so, my friends, the stage was set. I was no longer a boy of Corsica, nor merely a student of war. I was an officer of France. The world had not yet heard my name, but soon it would echo across Europe. But on that first night, as I lay upon my narrow bed in Paris, I did not think of glory or empire. I thought only of the stars above the city, the same stars I had once seen in Corsica. And I whispered to myself, as I often did, one day, destiny will come for me. Paris, a city of grand avenues and dark alleyways, of palaces and markets, of laughter and hunger. To some, it was the beating heart of civilization. To me, it was both a wonder and a burden. Tane. I was a young officer then, no more than 16 when I arrived, and still I felt the weight of my youth. Paris was alive with noise, the clatter of hooves upon cobblestones, the voices of merchants in crowded squares, the endless chatter of salons where noblemen and philosophers debated the future of France. Yet for all its brilliance, I walked its streets as a shadow quiet, unnoticed, observing. I had little money to spend. My family was respectable but not wealthy, and I could not afford the luxuries that many of my classmates enjoyed. While they attended balls and dined beneath chandeliers, I kept to my narrow quarters. My room was small and sparse, a bed, a desk, and a single candle that burned long into the night as I bent over books. It was there under the dim flicker of waxlight that I lost myself in studies. I traced the lines of fortresses, calculated the arcs of cannon fire, and studied the campaigns of the ancients. Alexander the Great, Caesar, Hannibal, they became my silent companions. I read their lives as one might read prayers before sleep, not merely for knowledge, but for inspiration. They had carved their names into history. Why not I? And yet, for all my ambition, there were nights when the silence pressed heavily upon me. The walls felt cold, the city outside seemed vast, and I was still but a stranger in it. I missed Corsica, the salty air, the rough voices, the mountains standing firm against the sea. In Paris, everything was polished, refined, and I with my accent, my stern ways, my austerity never quite belonged. But in solitude I found strength. Discipline became my shield. I rose early, worked tirelessly, spoke little, and listened much. When I did walk through the streets, I walked with purpose, as though destiny itself marched beside me. Perhaps I was trying to convince myself that I was more than just another young officer, unnoticed in the crowd. The city, meanwhile, was restless. Bread grew scarce, tempers ran high, and whispers of discontent echoed through taverns and markets. I heard the murmurs of the people of poverty, of anger toward the king, of hope for something new. Revolution was still a storm upon the horizon, but its winds already stirred. Paris at night seemed to tremble with anticipation, like the hush before thunder. Sometimes I would stand upon a bridge over the Seine and watch the water move in silence, reflecting the lanterns of the city. The river flowed endlessly, carrying secrets and dreams with it, and I thought to myself, the world too is moving, and I must be ready when the current takes me. My time in Paris did not bring me glory, nor wealth, nor fame, but it gave me the tools I would one day wield: knowledge, patience, and the steel of determination. It was in those quiet years, in my lonely room lit only by a dying candle, that the figure the world would one day call emperor was being forged slowly, silently, like iron in the fire. And so, as you rest tonight, imagine me there, a young man in a narrow bed, books scattered across the desk, a single candle burning low. Outside, the city hums with unrest, but inside, in the stillness, a dream grows, a dream that would soon awaken and shake the world. The year was 1785. I was 16 when I completed my studies at the École Militaire. I had rushed through my courses, completing in a single year what most required two to finish. Not because I was the most gifted, but because my father had passed away and money was scarce. Every coin mattered, and I knew I could not afford the luxury of time. So with discipline and long hours by candlelight, I pressed forward until the day came when I graduated young, pale, still thin from years of austerity, but now an officer of France. They placed upon my shoulders the uniform of the artillery. It was not a glamorous branch. There was no golden lace of the cavalry, no polished charm of the guards, no grandeur of glittering swords raised in parade. No artillery was science, mathematics, patience. It was smoke, iron, and thunder. A weapon of precision and destruction, and to me, it was perfect. I was given my first posting with the La Fère Regiment in the north of France, and there I began the quiet life of a young lieutenant. Each morning I rose early. The bugle would sound, boots would strike the stone of the courtyard, and the regiment would gather. Drills, inspections, training, the rhythm of military life was unchanging, yet it gave me purpose. I learned the weight of discipline, not only in myself but in those I commanded. Soldiers, I saw, required not just orders, but example. And so I kept myself strict, frugal, controlled, for how could I demand from others what I did not demand of myself? The cannons themselves fascinated me. Each had a character of its own. Some were light, swift, quick to wheel into position. Others were heavy beasts, stubborn, requiring the sweat of many men to move. I studied their ranges, their strengths, their flaws. I came to see them not merely as tools, but as companions in war, silent, unyielding, waiting for the spark that would wake them to thunder. While my fellow officers spent their evenings in company, gambling, or courting the attention of Parisian ladies, I remained apart. I had little money for such indulgences, and truth be told, little interest. My coins went home, to my mother, to my brothers and sisters in Corsica. My hours went to study. Books were my banquet, knowledge my treasure. History was always at my side. Caesar, Alexander, Hannibal. I read their campaigns not as idle tales, but as lessons, each victory and defeat a page in my own education. Mathematics, too, kept me company, for artillery demanded it. I filled notebook after notebook with calculations of angle and range, losing myself in numbers long after the barracks had fallen into sleep. Yet I was not without moments of reflection. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I walked the edges of the town where my regiment was stationed. The streets were narrow, the houses simple, the air carrying the scent of wood smoke. I would pause, listen to the silence of the countryside, and feel a strange stillness settle upon me. In those moments, I thought of Corsica, of my mother's stern gaze, of the mountains standing eternal against the sea. I missed it, yet I knew I could never return unchanged. Paris had shaped me, and the army had claimed me. France itself was restless. In the streets, the people grumbled. Bread grew scarce, the price of grain rose, and discontent spread like fire beneath dry straw. The salons of Paris buzzed with philosophy. Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu, words that stirred men's hearts to demand liberty, equality, and change. Though far from the capital, I felt the tremors of that discontent, like distant thunder rolling toward us. I was young, but I was not blind. I knew that something vast was coming. The old order trembled, and I felt within me a stirring certainty that when the storm broke, I would not stand idly by. I would seize the moment, and yet outwardly I remained quiet. I was simply Lieutenant Bonaparte, a young officer in a plain uniform, unknown, unnoticed, a boy among men, a stranger among nobles. But within I carried the same fire that had burned in me since Corsica. I remember one night most of all. The barracks had grown silent, the soldiers asleep, the candles burned down to stubs. I walked alone across the empty courtyard. The stones echoed beneath my boots. The air was sharp with the scent of powder, and above me the stars burned cold and eternal. I stopped, gazed upward, and felt the weight of their light upon me. In that silence, I whispered to myself words I had spoken many times before. One day, destiny will call my name. And I believed it. So, as you drift now into the stillness of sleep, imagine me there, a solitary young officer, walking beneath the stars, carrying nothing but a book, a sword, and an unshakable dream. The world had not yet heard my name, but soon it would. The world I stepped into as a young lieutenant was not the same world I had studied in books. It was not ordered, not steady, not certain. France was trembling. The year was 1789, and the air was heavy with discontent. I was 20 years old then, far from the glittering halls of Versailles, yet even in the provinces one could feel it like the faint rumble of an earthquake before the ground begins to break. Bread. It was bread that first stirred the anger of the people. The price rose, the shelves grew empty, and hunger gnawed at every home. I saw it in the faces of peasants, hollow-cheeked and weary, their hands rough with labor, their eyes burning with resentment. The nobles still feasted, the court still glittered, but in the streets men whispered of injustice. In Paris, the voices grew louder. Pamphlets passed hand to hand, words of liberty and equality filling the air like sparks waiting to ignite. Philosophers who had once spoken in salons now spoke to the masses, and their words struck like flint against stone. Rousseau, Voltaire names, once confined to books, now echoed in taverns and marketplaces. And then the storm broke. The Bastille fell. On that July day, the old prison, once a symbol of absolute power, was torn open by the people. Its gates crumbled, its stones shaken loose, and with them the illusion of unshakable monarchy. News of it spread like wildfire across France. I remember the moment I first heard, A messenger, breathless, speaking of Paris in flames, of mobs flooding the streets, of the king powerless before the tide. My heart quickened. For years I had studied war, strategy, the rise and fall of empires. Now I was no longer reading history, I was living it. Yet I was but a lieutenant, still unknown, still without a stage upon which to act. My regiment remained at its post, waiting, uncertain. We trained, we drilled, we watched the chaos unfold from afar. But inside me a fire stirred. Revolutions, I knew, devoured the weak and raised the bold. And I promised myself I would not be devoured. I spent my nights in thought, lying in my narrow bed, candlelight flickering across pages of books and scattered notes. Outside, the world changed. Inside, I prepared. I read not only of war, but of politics, of law, of philosophy. I sharpened my mind as I had once sharpened my sword, for I sensed that my time was drawing near. And yet there was uncertainty too. France was in turmoil, and no man could say how it would end. The king hesitated, the nobles resisted, and the people grew restless. It was like watching a storm swell over the horizon, magnificent, terrible, irresistible. I was still young, still learning, still waiting. But as I walked the parade grounds, as I studied the silent cannons lined in rows, I whispered to myself, when the moment comes, I will be ready. So as you drift into rest, imagine me then, a young officer standing beneath a darkening sky. The first rumblings of revolution echoing in the distance. The air is heavy, the world shifting, and though no one yet knows my name, I know in my heart that destiny is drawing closer. The storm has only begun. The years that followed my arrival in Paris and my commission as a young officer were years of tension, years where the very air seemed to tremble. France, my France, was no longer the same nation I had studied in my books at Brienne. It was a land divided by wealth, by privilege, by hunger. I was but 20 years old when I felt the first stirrings of what would soon be called the Revolution. It began not with great battles, nor with kings and crowns, but with something far simpler: bread. Bread, that most humble necessity of life. Its absence brought unease to the homes of peasants, to the tables of the poor. Families who worked from sunrise to dusk returned with hands blistered, bellies empty, and children crying from hunger. Bakers were accused of hoarding, merchants accused of greed. In every town square, voices grew sharper. And still the nobles of France feasted. Gilded halls in Versailles echoed with laughter, with music, with the clinking of glasses. While beyond their gates, hunger gnawed at the soul of the people. I remember walking through Paris during those early days, the streets alive with whispers. Pamphlets and newspapers littered the ground, handed out by fiery men with wide eyes and wild hair. They spoke of liberty, of equality, of rights. I read them all. At night, in the flicker of candlelight, I turned their words over in my mind. Rousseau, Montesquieu, Voltaire. Their voices, once confined to books and salons, now thundered in the mouths of common men and women. It was as though an old dream had broken its chains and was now running free through the streets. Then came the storming of the Bastille. The Bastille, a prison, yes, but more than stone and bars. It was a symbol of monarchy, of tyranny, of the old world. On that hot July day in 1789, it fell. The people of Paris swarmed its gates. They scaled its walls, they battered its doors, they seized its cannons. When at last its towers were broken, cheers rose like thunder. France had declared itself against its king. I did not see it with my own eyes, but when word reached me, I felt my pulse quicken. A fortress toppled by the common man? It was unthinkable, and yet it had happened. I remember staring long at my uniform that evening, its crisp lines, its polished buttons. I asked myself, what is my duty? To king and crown, or to the people who cry for freedom? In truth, I did not know. I was Corsican by birth, French by circumstance, a soldier by trade. My loyalty was torn. My heart beat with the promise of freedom, but my mind whispered caution. Revolutions devoured their own, and France was entering a storm with no clear path ahead. And so I waited. I drilled with my men, their boots stamping the earth, their muskets gleaming beneath the sun. The sound of cannon fire still came only from practice, not from war. Yet each day as I watched the world outside unravel, I felt the pull of destiny tighten around me. For in times of chaos, opportunity blooms. Paris grew restless. The National Assembly rose, declaring rights that had long been denied. The Declaration of the Rights of Man was read aloud in halls, in squares, in whispered conversations at taverns. Men who once had no voice now spoke boldly. Women, too, raised their demands. And yet, with every cry of liberty, came fear. Fear of violence. Fear of vengeance. Fear of the unknown. I walked through the streets one evening, the air heavy with the smell of smoke, torches flickering in every alley. I heard a man crying out, "No more kings! No more nobles!" Around him, a crowd roared in approval. The monarchy was trembling, and I, young and untested, felt myself caught between two worlds, the order I had been trained to serve and the storm that promised a new dawn. I confess in those quiet nights, alone with my thoughts, I wondered what role I was to play. Would I stand aside, a spectator to history, or would I step forward to grasp the reins of fate? When I thought of Corsica, of my father's dreams and my family's struggles, I felt a flame rise in me. Was I not born to more than obscurity? Was I not destined for something beyond the quiet marches of a forgotten garrison? Yes, I felt it. The revolution was no longer a tale I read in books. It was alive, unfolding before me, and though my part in it had not yet begun, I knew it was coming. So imagine me there, in the Paris of 1790. The city restless, the streets alive with chants and flames. My boots worn from endless walking, my uniform plain, my name unknown. And yet deep within, a certainty growing. A storm had been born in France, and storms raised men like me from obscurity to power. I waited. I watched. I prepared. And as you close your eyes and drift into sleep, picture me then, a young soldier standing at the edge of history, hearing the distant roar of revolution, and whispering to himself, "My time will come." Paris was alive with revolution, yet my thoughts, my roots, my very blood, still belonged to Corsica. I could not forget the island of my birth, the rocky coasts, the mountain paths, the scent of olive trees carried on the sea winds. Paris was the heart of France, yes, but Corsica was the soil from which I had grown. And so, not long after the storming of the Bastille, I returned. I was no longer the boy who had left for Brienne with uncertain steps. I was an officer now, carrying myself with the weight of training, knowledge, and duty. But I was also a son, a brother, and a Corsican, bound by ties deeper than any uniform. The island I returned to was not the same one I had left. Corsica was restless, pulled between France and the dream of independence. My father's old idol, Pasquale Paoli, had returned from exile, welcomed as a hero, as the father of Corsican liberty. His name was spoken with reverence in every village, every tavern. I admired him too. How could I not? He had fought for Corsican freedom long before my birth. He was a man of ideals, of courage. But with admiration came conflict. For Paoli distrusted France, and I, though Corsican at heart, had pledged myself to France through my commission. This torn loyalty became the great struggle of my youth. At home, my family welcomed me with warmth, though shadows lingered. My father had passed some years before, leaving my mother to guide us. She was strong, determined, never one to bend beneath hardship. My brothers and sisters looked to me with pride, though I knew I had brought them little more than stories and promises. Corsica, I realized quickly, was not at peace. Villages were split in their allegiances. Some raised the French tricolor with fervor, believing liberty in Paris would bring liberty to the island. Others clung to Paoli, demanding separation, independence, a Corsica free of all foreign crowns. I walked among them, listening to their words. Farmers with weathered hands, fishermen with salt-stained clothes, young men with fire in their eyes. Some hailed me as a soldier of France. Others whispered that I had betrayed Corsica by wearing the uniform of the occupier. I felt their judgment like a weight. And yet, even in that turmoil, I saw opportunity. My mind was ever restless, always turning toward strategy. I began to organize local militias, to speak of discipline, of defense, of strength. Corsica was my homeland, yes, but it was also a chessboard, and I was learning to play. But Paoli was no easy master to serve. At first he welcomed me, the son of Charles Bonaparte, the boy he remembered from years past. He praised my learning, my discipline, my service in France. Yet as months passed, mistrust crept in. He saw me not as an ally, but as a rival. Perhaps he sensed in me the hunger I tried to hide. I will not deny it even then. I dreamed of command, of shaping the destiny of nations. And Paoli, noble as he was, represented an old Corsica, bound by traditions I did not share. The people began to choose sides. Families were divided. My own name, once respected, became a mark of suspicion to those who hated France. Fights broke out in the villages, blades drawn, muskets fired in the night. The revolution in France had spilled into our island, and there was no escaping its reach. I remember one evening, standing upon a cliffside, the sea below dark and endless. The wind tore at my coat, carrying with it the cries of the island. My brother Joseph stood beside me. "This Napoleon," he said. "Do you ever wonder where you belong?" I looked at him, my elder brother, steady, thoughtful, always more cautious than I, and I told him the truth. "I belong," I said, "where destiny takes me." Even then I felt it. Corsica was my cradle, but it would not be my crown. My fate lay beyond those mountains, beyond that sea and the turmoil of France itself. But fate is never simple. Paoli and I grew further apart. His men turned against me. Accusations of betrayal spread. One night, violence came too close, and I realized with painful clarity, Corsica would not be mine to lead. The island I loved rejected me. It was then that I made a choice that would change everything. I turned my back on Corsica. With my family, I boarded a ship. The night was black, the sea unforgiving, and yet I felt no fear. For though I left behind the soil of my birth, I carried with me something greater, the certainty that I was meant for more than that island could offer. As Corsica's shores faded into the distance, I whispered to myself words that would guide me through all the storms to come. If they will not have me here, they will hear my name elsewhere. And so I returned to France, exiled not by decree, but by destiny. I had lost an island, yes, but I had gained a nation. The revolution was deepening. Paris called to me once more, and this time I would not stand at the edges of history. I would step directly into its fire. France was trembling. The revolution that had begun with cheers and promises now crackled with fear, with executions, with whispers of betrayal in every alley. Kings across Europe sharpened their blades, eager to strike down the new republic before it could rise. And in the south, a wound had opened, Toulon, a proud port city, its harbor deep enough to shelter great fleets. But its people, divided in their loyalties, had opened their gates to the enemy. The British, the Spanish, and their allies sailed in, raising their flags above French soil. To lose Toulon was to lose the Mediterranean. France could not allow it. I, Napoleon Bonaparte, was then but a young artillery captain, a captain among hundreds. My name was unknown beyond a few barracks. I had no fortune, no title, no claim to greatness. Only my mind, only my unyielding belief in discipline, in mathematics, in the silent thunder of cannon fire. When word spread that Toulon had fallen into royalist hands, the Republic called its armies south, and I went with them. The city was heavily fortified, guarded by redoubts, bastions, and the guns of the Royal Navy itself. Many said it could not be taken. The commanders argued, the soldiers despaired, the politicians in Paris demanded swift victory, but sent little aid. It was in this storm of doubt that I stepped forward. I remember the first time I walked the ground outside Toulon, tracing the lines of earth with my eyes, imagining the arc of every cannonball, the sweep of every musket shot. Where others saw chaos, I saw patterns. Where others saw walls, I saw weak points. Artillery. That was the key. Not reckless charges, not blind bravery, but precise fire. Mathematics given life by iron and powder. I proposed my plan. Capture the heights, silence the enemy batteries, and force the fleets to withdraw. With control of the harbor's guns, Toulon itself would crumble. At first they laughed. Who was I, a Corsican of little rank, to lecture generals? But when the first test was made, when my cannon roared and the enemy was forced back, they grew silent. And when victory followed, they began to listen. I worked tirelessly. Days bled into nights. I oversaw every battery, corrected every angle, drove my men hard. I was stern, perhaps too stern. But I knew that only discipline would bring us triumph. The soldiers grumbled at first, yet they came to respect me. They saw that I did not demand from them what I would not do myself. I stood in the mud beside them, marked out positions with my own hands, lifted tools, loaded guns. In those long days, they began to call me the little Corsican captain, with a tone that was no longer mockery, but admiration. Then came the night of storming. December winds whipped through the camp. Our plan was set, the assault upon the forts guarding Toulon's harbor. If we succeeded, the enemy fleet would be forced to retreat. If we failed, all France might despair. The drums beat, the soldiers advanced. I commanded the artillery, my voice hoarse, my hands trembling not with fear, but with the fire of purpose. Cannon thunder lit the sky. The redoubt shook beneath our assault. Men screamed, muskets flared, bayonets clashed. The ground was slick with blood, the air thick with smoke. I rode through the chaos, giving orders, steadying the line, always watching the angles, the distances, the mathematics of death. Then pain, a sudden burning in my thigh. A shot had struck me. For a moment the world spun, the roar of battle fading. But I would not fall. Gritting my teeth, I rose, refusing to show weakness. My men must not see me falter. Through the night we fought, hour upon hour, until at last the redoubt was ours. The enemy, stunned, began to falter. One by one, the forts fell into our hands. And as the dawn broke over the harbor, the British fleet raised anchor. Their sails, once so proud, shrank against the horizon. Toulon was ours. I had bled, but I had not fallen. And more importantly, France had seen me. In Paris, the news spread swiftly. The name of Napoleon Bonaparte, once unknown, now carried weight. A captain had done what generals could not. The politicians of the Republic marked my name, remembered my deeds. I was promoted, lifted from obscurity. For me, Toulon was more than victory. It was baptism. The first time destiny touched my shoulder and whispered, "This is the path." And yet, in those quiet hours after the battle, as I lay bandaged, listening to the distant cries of the wounded, I thought not of glory. I thought of the men who had fallen, of the cost of every step. Victory is intoxicating, yes, but it is also bitter, for every triumph rests upon the silence of those who will never rise again. Still, I knew Toulon had changed everything. No longer was I just a Corsican exile, the boy mocked at Brienne, the officer of little note. I had proven myself in the fire of battle. France had seen me, and I had seen myself. Destiny had begun its march. Toulon had given me a name. The newspapers carried it. The politicians whispered it. But France, France was a storm that spared no one. The revolution, which had once promised liberty and fraternity, now wore a darker mask. The guillotine stood tall in Paris, its blade falling day after day. Those who were heroes in the morning might be traitors by the evening. The air itself smelled of fear. I, Napoleon Bonaparte, found myself walking a fragile path. Promoted, yes, made a brigadier general before I had even turned 25, but still vulnerable, still surrounded by enemies in every direction. I was sent from camp to camp, entrusted with new duties, but always watched by suspicious eyes. Some whispered, "He is too ambitious, too bold, too clever." Others muttered, "He is a Corsican, not a true Frenchman." But I worked, tirelessly, endlessly. My notebooks filled with sketches of fortifications, calculations of ranges, theorems of movement and fire. I thought in terms of campaigns while others thought in terms of speeches. The army was my school, in the world my book. Yet, despite my efforts, fate turned her head away. There were times, after Toulon, when I stood on the very edge of ruin. The politicians shifted, the committees dissolved, the Jacobins fell, the terror rose, and then it fell as well. Each time the guillotine sang, it seemed my own name might be called next. For a season, I was even cast aside, stripped of command, placed under suspicion, forgotten in the shuffle of factions. The revolution, in its fever, had no patience for men who could not be easily controlled. I remember those days, the emptiness of being idle while others played at power. I paced rooms in Paris, restless, angry, fearing that my story had ended before it had even begun. My uniform hung unused, my sword lay sheathed. I had tasted glory, and then silence. But silence does not last forever. Paris itself was boiling. Famine gnawed at the city. Bread was scarce. Rumors ran like fire. The royalists, those who still dreamed of restoring the king, rose in rebellion against the Republic. It was October the year 1795, and the streets of Paris prepared for battle. The convention, the ruling government, panicked. The rebels had numbers, muskets, artillery. The Republic might fall within its own capital. And so they looked desperately for a commander, someone bold, someone ruthless enough to defend the revolution against its enemies. That was when destiny returned to me. I was called to the convention, and there, before the trembling deputies, I gave my answer. "Yes," I said simply, "I will defend Paris." How? With what? With cannon, of course. Always cannon. The rebels surged through the streets, tens of thousands, carrying their banners of defiance. They thought themselves triumphant, thought the city would open its gates to them. But I had already prepared my batteries. Grape shot, that was my answer. I placed the cannon at the crossroads, the alleys, the boulevards. I positioned them where the enemy would be forced to march. I waited, calm while the city held its breath. Then came the hour. The rebels advanced, drums beating, cries echoing off the stones of Paris. And I gave the order. The cannons roared. Grape shot tore through the columns, scattering them in an instant. Again and again the thunder fell until the rebels broke, running, crying, crushed beneath the weight of fire. It was over quickly. Too quickly for some, too brutally for others. They would later call it a whiff of grape shot. To me, it was simply necessity. Without it, the Republic would have been torn apart. And when the smoke cleared, when the streets lay silent once more, the deputies of the convention looked at me with new eyes. I was no longer the forgotten captain of Corsica, no longer the idle general without a command. I was the savior of Paris. It was then that fortune smiled upon me in another way. A man named Paul Barras, one of the leaders of the convention, took me under his wing. And through him, I was introduced to a woman whose name would become bound forever to my own, Josephine de Beauharnais. But that is a tale for another night. For now, as the fires of rebellion faded and Paris quieted under the cannon's shadow, I felt the wheel of destiny turning once again. Toulon had shown my talent. Paris had shown my ruthlessness. Together they carved the path forward. The revolution was still dangerous, still uncertain, but I had survived it. More than survived, I had risen higher. The boy from Corsica was no longer merely watching history. He was beginning to write it. Paris, after the smoke of rebellion had cleared, was once again restless. But for me, its streets took on a new light, for it was there that I met her Josephine. Her name, like a whisper, drifted toward me through the salons of the city. Those gathering places of laughter, wit, and schemes. She was not like the women I had known before. She was older, yes, by a few years, yet that only deepened her allure. She had suffered, that much was clear. She had lived through the revolution's cruelties. Her husband had fallen to the guillotine. She herself had once stood in the shadow of death. Yet she had survived. And in her survival there was a grace, a resilience, a strength I could not help but admire. Her beauty was not the sharp, striking kind that arrests you in a single glance. No, it was softer, like moonlight, like the warmth of a lingering melody. Her smile could disarm, her eyes could persuade, her voice could soothe even the most restless heart. And for me, Napoleon Bonaparte, the restless soldier, the calculating commander, she was a mystery I longed to solve. When I first stood before her, I was not the confident general who had fired cannon into the streets of Paris. No, I was once more the awkward youth, the boy from Corsica, with too large dreams and too few words. She spoke with ease, with charm. She knew the ways of Parisian society, the subtle dance of compliments and glances. And me? I stumbled, I fumbled, my words tumbling out too quick, too eager. But she only smiled. Ah, how quickly I fell under her spell. Each letter I wrote her dripped with longing. I wrote not as a general but as a lover, as a boy who had found the sun at last. I called her my sweet Josephine, my gentle Josephine. My pen could march armies across paper, yet for her it only spilled out poems of desire. And yet Josephine was cautious. She had known loss, she had known disappointment. She did not rush as I rushed. Her heart, I think, was slower to trust, slower to leap. But fate, ever watchful, bound us together. Through barras, through the shifting currents of politics, I courted her. I pressed, I pursued. And in March of 1796, we were married. The ceremony was quick, almost careless in its details. There was no splendor, no parade, only papers signed and vows exchanged. I was 26, she was 32. But when I placed the ring upon her hand, I thought myself the happiest man in all of France. And yet even in that moment, there were shadows. For as I pledged my heart to her, she was not yet entirely mine. There were whispers of her lovers, of her debts, of her ties to men who had smoothed her way through Paris. I chose to ignore them. Or perhaps I was too blinded by desire to see. I only knew this. With Josephine by my side, I felt complete. She softened me. She balanced me. She gave me the tenderness that my soldier's life had long denied. But destiny, impatient as ever, did not allow us time to linger in love's embrace. Almost at once after our marriage, orders came. I was to take command of the army of Italy, a ragged, starving force, demoralized and forgotten. Where others saw a hopeless posting, I saw a stage. The night before I left, I wrote to her, pouring my soul onto the page. In the midst of activity, of my duties, of the great events surrounding me, I shall never cease to think of you. I kissed her hand, I kissed her lips, and then I left Paris, carrying with me the warmth of her presence, even as I marched toward the chill of the Alps. That was Josephine, the flame I carried in my heart, the name upon my lips in moments of despair, the face that haunted my sleep. She was not perfect. No, she was human, fragile, flawed, but she was mine. And in those early days, I believed we would never part. Ah, my sweet Josephine, how could I know then how much joy and how much sorrow you would bring me? But that, as always, is for later in our tale. For now, let us leave the newlyweds in Paris, she among her salons, her admirers, her perfumes. I upon the road to Italy, with the weight of command upon my shoulders and her name beating in my heart. The general was about to become a legend. But the man remained hopelessly, desperately in love. When I left Paris, I carried not only the memory of Josephine's perfume, still clinging to my coat, but also the weight of France's trust. They had given me an army, if such a word could be used. Ah, Army of Italy, they called it. But what I found as I rode into camp was little more than a gathering of ragged men. Their boots were worn to threads, their coats patched and torn, their stomachs empty, their faces hollow. They had fought too long for too little and believed themselves forgotten. The officers carried little more pride than the soldiers. Many had grown lazy, others bitter. Their pay was overdue, their weapons rusted. This was the army I was meant to lead against the Austrians and their allies, disciplined, well-fed, armed to the teeth. Yet when I looked upon them, I did not see despair. I saw potential. I saw men who only needed to believe again. On that first day, I gathered them, rank upon rank, before me. I was small, yes, and young, my uniform still too stiff, my voice not yet thunderous like the marshals I would one day command. But I had words, and words can be sharper than any blade. I looked into their weary eyes and spoke. Soldiers, you are naked, you are hungry. The government owes you much but can give you nothing. Your patience, your courage, do you think they will be rewarded? No. The government owes you everything, but I will lead you to riches, to honor, to glory. Beyond these mountains lie fertile plains, rich cities, treasures enough to reward you for your suffering. Soldiers, will you endure poverty or will you follow me into victory? Their eyes lit with fire, their backs straightened. For the first time in months, they felt hope. They saw not their rags, but their weapons. They saw not their empty bellies, but the land that awaited them beyond the Alps. And thus began the Italian campaign. It was not easy. Ah, the roads were cruel, muddy tracks that swallowed carts, steep passes where the wind bit at our bones. The Austrians waited in numbers greater than ours, with cannon and supplies. But I moved faster than they believed possible. Speed was my ally. Where they thought us far away, we struck. Where they prepared for battle, we had already moved. I divided them, struck them piecemeal, drove wedges through their lines until the mighty Austrian force was scattered like leaves in a storm. At Montenotte, they felt our first blow. My men, once weary and hopeless, charged with a fury that startled even themselves. They tasted victory, and once tasted, it was a hunger greater than any bread could satisfy. From Montenotte to Millesimo, from Lodi to Arcole, the names of battles still ring in my memory, each one a step higher, each one a rung upon the ladder of destiny. Do you know what it is to stand upon a bridge at Lodi, the enemy's cannon roaring, your men hesitating as the shot tears through their ranks? I remember seizing the standard, charging forward, leading them myself across the fire-swept boards. For in that moment, they did not follow a general, they followed a man who dared first. Later they would call me the Little Corporal, not in mockery, but in affection, for I shared their danger, their hardships, their victories. I did not command from afar. I was there, muddy, hungry, sleepless, beside them. And slowly this army of rags became an army of steel. Italy bent beneath our march. Lombardy fell into our hands. Milan opened its gates to us, its bells ringing not in defiance, but in welcome. The riches flowed food, gold, silks, and my soldiers at last were rewarded. Yet victory brought more than treasure. It brought me renown. My name, once spoken only in the corridors of Paris, now spread across Europe. The Austrians trembled, the kings muttered. The world asked, "Who is this young general, this Napoleon?" But for me there was more than conquest. For each triumph, each city, each treaty signed, I thought of Josephine. I wrote to her with the passion of a man who fights not only for glory, but for love. My letters burned with longing, with desire, with the desperate cry of a heart far from its flame. Did she answer with equal fire? Ah, no, her replies were softer, delayed, distracted. And whispers reached me, whispers that while I marched across Italy, Josephine entertained others in Paris. Yet still, I loved her. Still, I pressed her name upon my lips before battle. Still, I dreamed of her as I laid beneath the stars. The earth my bed, victory my blanket. Such is the way of destiny. Glory in the field, ache in the heart. And so the campaign pressed on. By 1797, Austria itself was at the edge of defeat. The Treaty of Campo Formio was signed, and with it, the map of Europe redrawn by my hand. I had begun with a starving army. I ended with a continent trembling. The boy from Corsica was no longer just a general. He was a conqueror. But destiny is never satisfied. When one peak is reached, another, higher still, appears upon the horizon. And my gaze, restless as ever, turned to the east to Egypt, to the sands where empires had risen and fallen like the tides. Paris had grown restless. The revolution had devoured its kings, its queens, its enemies, and yet it was never satisfied. In its place sat the directory of fragile government of cautious men who mistrusted me, Napoleon, as much as they needed me. I had returned from Italy crowned with laurels, adored by my soldiers, sung of by the people. My name was too loud, too dangerous. They feared me. They feared what power I might seize next. So when I proposed an expedition to the east to Egypt, they agreed too quickly. Let him go, they thought. Let him carry his ambition far from Paris. Let him sink into the sands. They did not see what I saw. For I dreamed of more than France. I dreamed of an empire to rival Alexander's. I dreamed of cutting Britain from her colonies in India, of raising my standard where pyramids pierced the sky. And so in the summer of 1798, I set sail. My fleet, vast and glittering, carried not only soldiers, but scholars, artists, scientists. For where I marched, knowledge must march also. I was not merely a conqueror. I would be a bringer of civilization. The voyage across the Mediterranean was long, restless. We slipped past the watchful eye of the British Navy, and when at last the coast of Egypt rose before us, it was like a vision from another age. Palm trees swaying, golden sands stretching endlessly, and beyond them, Cairo, the heart of the East. Our landing was swift, our march relentless. The Mamluks, proud horsemen of ancient tradition, rode to meet us. They glittered with armor, their steeds swift and fierce. They believed themselves invincible. But their valor was no match for French discipline. At the Battle of the Pyramids, I formed my soldiers into great squares, unbreakable walls of men, bristling with bayonets and fire. The Mamluks charged again and again, but their horses found no gaps, their sabers no flesh. Our squares held, unshaken, and the desert drank their blood. Behind us the pyramids stood silent, eternal, as if watching, as if judging. I looked upon them and declared to my men, from the height of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you. Those words, they were more than a boast. They were a bridge, for I felt in that moment not only the weight of history upon me, but the certainty that I too belonged among the giants of time. We entered Cairo, the city of 1,000 minarets, where the muezzins' call mingled with the tramp of our boots. I sought to win the people not only with arms, but with symbols, with proclamations. I told them we came not as conquerors, but as friends, not as destroyers, but as liberators. And my scholars, oh, my savants, they worked tirelessly. They mapped the land, studied its ancient temples, recorded its hieroglyphs. One of them, in a dusty town called Rosetta, uncovered a stone, etched with strange letters, Greek, Demotic, and the sacred script of the pharaohs. They did not know it yet, but they had found the key to a lost world. Thus my campaign was not only of war, but of discovery. France was not merely to rule Egypt, she was to enlighten it. But glory is fragile. While I stood beneath the pyramids across the sea, disaster struck. At Aboukir Bay, the British fleet under Nelson descended upon my ships. In a night of fire and thunder, our fleet was destroyed. The Mediterranean was lost. Egypt became my prison. And yet I did not falter. I turned disaster into destiny. With no escape by sea, I pressed deeper inland. I fought the Ottomans, marched into Syria, stood against the plague itself. My men, weakened, sick, weary of the burning sun and endless marches, looked to me, always to me. There were nights I lay awake in my tent, the desert winds rattling the canvas, the stars burning like ancient eyes. And I thought of Josephine, still in Paris, still far away. I thought of her letters, some tender, some cold. Whispers of betrayal still haunted me, yet I clung to her image as if it were my only tether. I was a conqueror in Egypt, a pharaoh in all but name, yet in my heart I remained a man lonely, restless, unfulfilled. And when fortune shifted again, when word came of fresh upheaval in France, of opportunity, of weakness in the Directory, I knew Egypt was but a stepping stone. One night, with the desert moon shining silver upon the Nile, I resolved my course. I would return to France, not as a general, not as a servant of the Directory, but as something greater. And so, leaving my army behind, I sailed homeward. The East had not broken me, it had shaped me. It had taught me the patience of the desert, the mystery of the ancients, the hunger of empires. Now Paris awaited, and with it, destiny. The sea was unkind to us. Our ship creaked and groaned, the waves striking with fury, as if the Mediterranean itself resented my escape. Behind me lay Egypt, a dream half fulfilled, half broken, its sands still whispering of empires lost. Ahead of me lay France, restless and fractured. When at last I stepped upon her shores, I was no longer simply the general of Italy or the conqueror of Egypt. I was something more dangerous, a man who had touched both triumph and disaster, yet emerged untamed. France, too, had changed. The Directory, weak and corrupt, stumbled beneath the weight of its own incompetence. Inflation gnawed at the people, enemies pressed upon our borders, and the revolution, once a fire, now smoldered into ash. The people longed for stability, for order, for strength. And when they looked for such a figure, they saw me. Paris greeted me not with suspicion, but with fever. Crowds cheered, women waved their handkerchiefs, veterans raised their caps. The streets were alive with hope, hope that I might deliver them from chaos. Yet hope is not enough. Power must be seized, carefully, ruthlessly, or it vanishes like mist. The politicians of the Directory welcomed me with smiles that hid their fear. They believed they might use me, as one uses a sword sharp, decisive, but always sheathed at their will. How poorly they judged me. I was not their weapon. I was their replacement. The plan formed quickly. With the aid of loyal allies, Sieyès, Talleyrand, and my devoted brother Lucien, we would sweep away the Directory, silence the weak, and build a new government with me at its helm. It was called the coup of 18 Brumaire, though to me it was more than a date upon a revolutionary calendar. It was the moment fate bent toward me. On that day, the chambers of the Directory filled with shouting, with panic. I strode among them, my uniform gleaming, my presence a thunderclap. They hurled accusations. They called me traitor, usurper, tyrant in waiting. But their words carried no weight. The soldiers outside did not listen to them. They listened to me. When I spoke, they obeyed. When I commanded, they acted. The politicians, so used to endless debate, discovered that true power does not lie in speeches, but in the loyalty of men with bayonets. And so, with a single gesture, the Directory was dissolved. Their era ended not with applause nor with the roar of revolution, but with the quiet march of soldiers removing them from their seats. In its place rose the consulate, sleek, efficient, new, and at its head the first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte. No longer a servant of the Republic, no longer a mere general. I was the state itself. Yet that night, as I sat in my chambers in the Tuileries Palace, silence wrapped around me like a cloak. The cheers of the crowds had faded, the bustle of soldiers stilled. For the first time, I felt the weight of absolute power pressing upon my shoulders. I thought of Josephine, her perfume lingering in the halls, her laughter a balm against the chill of ambition. She had stood by me, faltering yet faithful enough. But now our bond was not merely personal, it was political. She was no longer just my wife. She was France's first lady. And I was France. The path before me gleamed like marble beneath torchlight. I could see it stretching far, far ahead. Victories yet to come, titles yet unclaimed, thrones yet to be seized. The revolution had given me my chance. Now I would reshape it, mold it, and in time surpass it. France had chosen me, but truly, had they ever had a choice? That night I slept not as a soldier, nor as a wanderer returned, but as a ruler crowned not by kings or priests, but by destiny itself. The age of Napoleon had begun. When the coup was done and the Directory lay in ashes, France breathed a strange sigh of relief. The streets of Paris, so long filled with hunger and unrest, now stirred with cautious hope. They had known years of blood, of guillotines and tumbling heads, of endless speeches and hollow promises. Now they sought something simpler: stability, peace, a leader who could guide them through the wreckage of revolution. That leader was me. As first consul, I did not wear a crown nor sit upon a throne. I wore the uniform of a soldier, simple and sharp, as if to remind France that I was one of them, born not of royalty, but of struggle. Yet beneath that uniform, I was no longer just a general. I was a statesman, a reformer, a man determined to rebuild a nation shattered by its own ideals. France was fractured not only in politics, but in the very lives of her people. The revolution had torn down the church, burned noble estates, and scattered laws like ashes in the wind. Farmers tilled soil without certainty, merchants sold their wares with no coin they could trust, and students studied without a future to aspire to. This, I resolved, would change. I gave France a new code of laws, clear, firm, and just. The Code Napoleon, as they would come to call it, was not merely a set of rules. It was the scaffolding upon which society could be rebuilt. Property rights secured, contracts enforced, and citizens protected by law rather than whim. Even centuries later, its principles would echo in courts across the world. I reformed the schools, for knowledge was power, and I meant to shape generations not into idle dreamers, but into engineers, officers, and citizens loyal to the state. The lycée became my forges, where young men were molded into the iron that would strengthen France. I restored peace with the church, signing a concordat that soothed the faithful without surrendering authority. Religion would be tolerated, practiced freely, but no pope would rule in France again. I strengthened the economy, creating a new Bank of France to stabilize the currency and revive trade. I built roads, bridges, and canals, binding the nation together like arteries carrying lifeblood. Everywhere my hand reached, disorder gave way to order, confusion to clarity. France, once stumbling and broken, began to rise again. But I was not content with mere governance. I was no caretaker of the present, I was the architect of the future. And in that future, I saw myself not only as the guardian of France, but as its embodiment. Yet even as I labored by day to shape the nation, by night I remained haunted by the ambitions stirring within me. The revolution had stripped kings of their crowns, but I felt a different destiny pressing against my heart. France would not remain a republic forever. She would have her glory restored not by Bourbon monarchs, but by me. My enemies saw it too, though they dared not speak it aloud. In London, in Vienna, in Berlin, whispers grew. Napoleon had risen, and soon he would not stop at France's borders. The old monarchies of Europe, shaken by revolution, now trembled before a new storm that bore my name. At home, the people adored me. Soldiers marched with my name upon their lips. Peasants toasted my victories in village taverns. In Paris, once weary of generals and politics, now beat with the rhythm of my will. But adoration is a fragile thing, and power more fragile still. I knew I must prove myself not only through reforms, but through conquest. For France was a nation born of war, and without victory, even the strongest ruler would falter. Thus my gaze turned once more beyond the Alps, toward Italy, Austria, and the old enemies who refused to yield. If France was to rise, she would rise not only by law and reform, but by the march of armies, by the thunder of cannons, and by the shadow of my eagles spreading across Europe. The time of the first consul was only the beginning. The time of empire lay just ahead. Though I was now first consul, though I sat at the center of government and reshaped France with ink and decree, I could never ignore the call of war. Politics might bring order, but it was on the battlefield that my destiny was carved. Across the Alps, in northern Italy, Austria threatened once again. Their armies pressed against French holdings, eager to drive us from the fertile plains and mountain passes that had so often decided the fate of empires. France could not afford to lose there. I could not afford to lose there. And so, in the spring of 1800, I set forth once more not as a general subordinate to politicians, but as the first consul himself, carrying the weight of a nation. The journey was perilous, a feat worthy of myth. We did not march through easy valleys nor wide roads. We took the path of Hannibal himself, across the towering Alps where snow buried stone and icy winds bit at the flesh. Picture it, an army of thousands, not only soldiers, but horses, cannon, and wagons, threading along narrow mountain trails. The peaks rose like jagged teeth, white with eternal snow. Men slipped upon frozen paths, carts toppled into the abyss, and more than once we seemed on the brink of disaster. Yet step by step, we pressed forward. I rode among them, not carried on soft litters, but upon a simple mule, guiding, encouraging, reminding them that beyond the mountains lay glory. In time, artists would paint me astride a magnificent horse, cloak billowing, finger pointing toward destiny. The truth was humbler and far colder, but the myth captured the essence. Napoleon leading his men where few dared to tread. At last we descended into Italy, the snow giving way to green valleys and distant towns. But no sooner had our boots touched softer ground than the Austrians moved to meet us. They had gathered a formidable force under General Melas, confident that they would crush us before we could recover from our grueling march. On the 14th of June, near the village of Marengo, the fields became our battlefield. That morning, the Austrians struck with ferocity. Their columns advanced, muskets blazing, cannons thundering. My men fought bravely, but the weight of Austrian numbers drove us back. Hours passed, and the sun rose high, burning upon armor and sweat-streaked faces. By midday, it seemed defeat loomed. Our lines wavered, men fell in retreat, and whispers spread. Was this the end? But I did not yield. I studied the ground, the angles of advance, the rhythm of the battle. The Austrians, so eager in their push, had overextended themselves. Their strength was no longer solid. It was stretched, brittle, vulnerable. And so, as the afternoon waned, I called upon my reserve, General Desaix, who had arrived with fresh troops. He was a man of courage, a commander of great promise, and though fate had cruel plans for him that day, his charge would turn the tide. With Desaix's men surging forward and my cavalry sweeping into the Austrian flanks, the battlefield shifted. Where despair had ruled, hope returned. Where retreat had begun, counterattack thundered. The Austrians, once pressing confidently, now reeled under the sudden storm. In the chaos, Desaix fell, struck down before his time. His death was a bitter wound, but his sacrifice became the spark of victory. As night drew near, the Austrians broke, retreating in disorder. Marengo belonged to us. That day, France was saved. That day, my power as first consul was secured beyond question. The newspapers in Paris would not whisper of near defeat, they would sing of triumph. The people would not see their leader falter, they would see him as invincible. And so upon the fields of Marengo, amid the smoke and silence of fallen men, I understood. I was not merely a soldier, nor a statesman. I was the destiny of France. The crossing of the Alps, the victory at Marengo, these became more than battles. They became symbols, living proof that fortune walked beside me. The world saw it, my enemies feared it, and my people adored it. Yet within me, ambition grew restless. Victory was never enough. For in the whispers of soldiers around campfires, in the cheers of peasants as I rode through towns, in the gazes of politicians who now bent their wills to mine, I felt something larger stirring. The Republic was mine to command, but in my heart I knew France would not remain a republic for long. The time was drawing near when I would crown myself not only first consul, but emperor. The victory at Marengo had changed everything. France, so often uncertain, so often caught in the storms of revolution and war, now stood behind me with renewed faith. The people whispered not of chaos, but of destiny. They whispered of Napoleon. When I returned to Paris, the streets erupted in celebration. Men and women filled the boulevards, waving flags, tossing flowers, shouting until their voices cracked. They saw me not merely as a general, nor even as the first consul, but as the savior of France. And in truth, I let them see me that way. For a leader is often the reflection of what his people desire most. Yet in the quiet of the night, when the noise of crowds faded and the candles burned low, I thought of Marengo not as a triumph alone. I thought of how near we had come to defeat, how fragile fortune could be, how swiftly the wheel of fate might turn. I knew then I must build something stronger than victory alone. I must build permanence. And so began the years of reform, years when I reshaped France, not with the sword alone, but with laws, with institutions, with ideas. The land was still fractured by revolution. Old nobles who had survived exile longed for their estates. Peasants who had seized land under the revolution feared losing it again. Merchants desired stability. Soldiers wanted pay and honor. And so I sought to balance these forces to give each enough that they would hold their peace. The greatest of my works was the law itself, the code that would carry my name. I dreamed of laws that were not scattered decrees, not the tangled threads of monarchy or revolution, but clear, logical, fair. A code that would place justice above privilege, that would make France not only stronger, but united under one system of order. By day, I sat with jurists, scholars, men who argued over principles of property, family, commerce. By night, I reviewed their drafts, making notes, crossing lines, reshaping words. Out of these long hours was born the civil code of France, the Napoleonic code, a gift to the people that would outlive even my empire. But law was not my only tool. Education, too, became my weapon. I believed that a nation could not be strong without knowledge, discipline, and merit. And so I created school lycée where the sons of France, not just nobles, could be trained to serve the nation. I cared little for a man's birth. What mattered was his ability, his discipline, his loyalty. The church, too, required settlement. Long torn apart from the revolution, it left France divided between faith and reason, between the altar and the state. I knew the people needed both order and belief, and so I signed a concordat with the Pope. The church would return to France, but it would not rule France. It would exist under the authority of the state under my authority. These reforms were my true victories. Muskets and cannon might win a field, but law, schools, and institutions would win the centuries. Even now, long after my fall, those who study history speak of the code, the lycées, the concordat not as fleeting acts of war, but as foundations that endured. Yet, as I labored to build this France, I also watched Europe. Beyond our borders, kings and emperors eyed me with suspicion. Austria licked its wounds. Britain, ever defiant, ruled the seas in plotted coalitions. And though we signed treaties, the Treaty of Luneville, the Treaty of Amiens, though for a brief moment the drums of war grew quiet, I knew peace was but a pause. I rode through Paris during these years and saw children playing in streets free of cannon fire, mothers gathering bread without fear of famine, men raising their heads with pride again. And yet in my heart I wondered, would this peace last? Or was it only the silence before the storm? At home the people adored me. In the chambers of power, politicians bent to my will. But whispers grew louder. Whispers of empire, of monarchy reborn, of Napoleon as not merely consul for 10 years, nor even consul for life, but something greater. I did not chase those whispers. I let them circle. I let them grow. For I knew that power is never seized by those who beg for it. It is given by those who long to believe. And the people of France, weary of uncertainty, longed to believe in permanence. And so, as the year 1802 passed, and I was named consul for life, I felt the inevitable drawing closer. My steps were carrying me beyond the revolution that had birthed me, beyond the republic I had sworn to serve. I was not merely the first consul of France. I was becoming the embodiment of France, and soon I would place upon my brow a crown. The year was 1804. Paris, once a city of revolution and guillotines, now hummed with something different. Anticipation. The streets whispered not of republics or consuls, but of something older, grander, something that reached back to Charlemagne and the Caesars. They whispered of empire. For years, France had lived with uncertainty. Kings had fallen, blood had flowed, the revolution had promised liberty, but delivered terror. And then I came. Victories followed, order was restored, reforms began to shape daily life. But the people wanted more than stability, they wanted permanence. They wanted to believe that the turmoil of the past would never return. It was not enough to be consul for life. Titles shift with the wind, governments change, but an emperor could embody eternity. And so I accepted what was already written in the hearts of my people. I would be crowned. The preparations began months in advance. Paris transformed itself into a stage worthy of history. Notre Dame, with its soaring arches and centuries-old stone, was chosen as the place. Yet it was no ordinary coronation I planned, for this was not the return of Bourbon monarchy, nor a restoration of the old order. This was something new, something born of revolution, but reaching for empire. I invited Pope Pius VII to preside, for what greater symbol of legitimacy than the blessing of the Church? Yet I knew in my soul that no pope, no priest, no ancient hand would decide my fate. France would see that my power came not from Rome, nor from tradition, but from my own will and from the will of the people. The morning of December 2nd dawned cold and misty. As I stepped into my carriage, the streets of Paris erupted with cries. Citizens pressed forward, their breath fogging in the winter air, waving tricolor banners alongside golden eagles, symbols of both revolution and empire woven into one. The sound of drums echoed down the boulevards, mingling with bells that tolled across the city. Notre Dame itself gleamed with splendor. The cathedral was draped in rich fabrics, its altars adorned with candles that flickered like stars. Nobles in fine dress, generals in polished uniforms, foreign dignitaries with watchful eyes all filled the hall, their gazes fixed on me. For they knew this was not simply a ceremony, it was a turning point in the history of France. I wore robes of crimson velvet, embroidered with golden bees, symbols of immortality, chosen over the lilies of the old monarchy. At my side was Josephine, radiant and graceful, her gown shimmering like moonlight. She looked every bit the empress she was about to become. As the choir swelled, as incense curled through the air, Pope Pius VII raised his hand to bless the crown. It gleamed, heavy with jewels, ancient in design yet new in purpose. All eyes watched, waiting for the moment when the Pope would place it upon my head. But I did not bow. I did not kneel. With steady hands, I took the crown myself. I lifted it high for all to see, the weight of history pressing down, the gaze of thousands upon me. And then, slowly, deliberately, I placed it upon my own head. Gasps rippled through the cathedral. Some saw audacity, others genius, but all understood the message. I owed my power to no one but myself and to France. After crowning myself, I turned to Josephine. She knelt gracefully, her eyes shining with pride and perhaps a trace of fear. Gently, I lowered a second crown onto her brow. She rose an empress, the equal to my empire, her hand light upon mine. The choir thundered, cannons roared outside, and Paris shook with celebration. But for me in that moment, it was not triumph alone. It was resolve, for the crown was not merely an ornament of gold and jewels. It was a burden, a responsibility, a symbol of unending struggle. The revolution had promised equality. I would preserve its spirit. The monarchy had promised grandeur. I would surpass it. The empire would be something new discipline, merit-based, ambitious, an empire of laws, of armies, a vision. As I stood crowned within Notre Dame, I thought of Caesar crossing the Rubicon, of Charlemagne crowned at Aachen, of Alexander gazing upon the horizons of Asia. I too would carve my name upon history's stone. Yet even then, as the bells rang and the people roared with joy, a shadow lingered. Across the sea, Britain sharpened its fleets. In Vienna and Berlin, monarchs plotted coalitions. They watched my coronation not with admiration, but with fear. For they knew a new emperor in France meant only one thing: Europe would burn again. But on that day, I did not think of fear. I thought only of destiny, of the empire I would build, of the future that stretched before me like an endless horizon. France had crowned its emperor, and the world would soon tremble at his march. The crown was on my head, the cheers still echoed in my ears. But I knew the ceremony was only the beginning. A title alone could not hold an empire together. No, what France needed was more than pageantry. It needed order, justice, progress. An emperor is not simply a ruler to be admired. He must be an architect, a builder, a guardian of his people's daily lives. Paris, after my coronation, glittered like a jewel. The wide boulevards bustled with markets and carriages. Cafes rang with debates, laughter, and the clinking of porcelain cups. Yet beneath the charm of the capital lay the memory of years of turmoil, bread riots, revolutionary terror, endless changes in government. The people craved something firm, something lasting. So I set about building not just an empire of armies, but an empire of laws. My greatest legacy was not the cannon or the saber, but the Code Napoleon. With it, I sought to bring clarity to chaos, to replace the tangle of old feudal customs with one body of law that all could understand. Property rights were secured, contracts defined, marriage and inheritance made orderly. A farmer in Provence, a merchant in Lyon, a clerk in Paris, all could now stand equal before the same law. No privilege of noble birth, no confusion of local customs. Justice became predictable, solid, written in stone. Even as I speak now in your quiet chamber centuries later, the laws of nations still echo with the structure of my code. Education, too, I reformed. France could not depend on luck or birth for its future leaders. I created the lycée schools for boys from every background, where discipline, mathematics, science, and history shaped new generations. Merit, not lineage, would determine who rose. The classroom became a battlefield of its own, where young minds sharpened into the officers, judges, and ministers who would carry France forward. Religion, once the spark of bitter division, I tamed with the Concordat of 1801. Though I had already crowned myself before the Pope, I understood the power of faith among my people. Catholicism was restored as the religion of the majority, yet Protestants and Jews too found tolerance under my reign. The church was bound to the state, its influence moderated, its priests made servants of peace rather than war. In the streets of Paris, the changes were felt in smaller, more intimate ways. Markets grew steadier, prices more reliable. Farmers sold their grain without fear of confiscation. Roads stretched farther, smoother, as armies and commerce alike needed quick passage. Bridges were built, canals carved, harbors improved. The city itself began to transform. I envisioned wide avenues, triumphal arches, monuments to remind every Frenchman that he was part of something greater than himself. The Arc de Triomphe was laid down in stone, not merely as a decoration, but as a promise that the deeds of French soldiers would be honored for eternity. Josephine, at my side, made the imperial court shimmer with elegance. She gathered artists, musicians, and writers, turning the Tuileries into a palace of refinement. Balls glittered with light, the gowns of ladies swirled in silks and jewels, generals bowed stiffly in uniforms heavy with medals. Foreign ambassadors, once skeptical of this upstart emperor, could not help but be impressed by the grandeur of our court. And yet I never lost myself in velvet and candlelight. Each morning I rose early, worked tirelessly, reviewed reports, signed decrees, and dictated letters. My ministers often collapsed from exhaustion before I did. For me, power was not indulgence. but labor. France was vast, restless, demanding, and I would not allow a single hour to be wasted. The people adored me. Songs were sung in my honor. Prints of my face sold in marketplaces. Children named after me. When I appeared in public, whether on horseback or in carriage, crowds surged with shouts of "Vive l'Empereur!" Some loved me for the victories, others for the bread on their table, others still for the hope that the age of guillotine and fear was truly over. And from one. But even as I worked to bind France together with laws, schools, and roads, the wider world was not blind. Across the Channel, Britain watched uneasily, its ships prowling the seas, its treasury funding enemies. To the east, Austria and Russia whispered to one another, plotting coalitions. They saw in my reforms not stability, but danger. For a France strong and united, led by a soldier who turned himself emperor, was a France that could not be ignored. Yet in these years at home within my empire, there was peace. Peace enough for growth, for healing, for the revolution's wounds to scab over. Peace enough for mothers to sing their children asleep, for farmers to harvest in security, for soldiers to return home and walk the streets in uniform with pride. It was a golden season, the brief time when France stood balanced between the legacy of revolution and the storms of war. The empire was young, vigorous, full of promise. And I, Napoleon, its heart and will, believed no force in the world could stop its rise. But beyond France's borders, the drums of war had not fallen silent. They beat softly at first, carried by distant winds. Soon they would thunder again, calling me to the field, where my destiny and my empires would be tested once more. The peace I had built within France could never silence the fears of kings abroad. Across Europe, monarchs trembled at the thought of an emperor who had risen not by birth but by merit, who governed with laws rather than divine right. They whispered among themselves, France was too strong, Napoleon must be stopped. So the third coalition was born, Britain at sea, Austria and Russia on land, with gold flowing from London to fund their armies. They thought they had me trapped, cornered, outmatched. But I was never one to wait for fate to corner me. If Europe's crowned heads sought to test me, then I would answer not with words, but with movement. In the autumn of 1805, I gathered my grande armée, the proud soldiers I had trained and marched across France. They were lean, disciplined, hardened by years of campaign. They trusted me, as I trusted them. Together we formed a bond of steel. I was their emperor, but also their comrade, their guiding star. We moved swiftly, so swiftly that the enemy scarcely understood where we were. The Austrians believed we would invade Britain. Instead, we turned east. In a whirlwind of marching, bridges, and feints, I struck into the heart of Central Europe. My soldiers lived off the land, carrying little, moving light, their boots pounding roads that seemed endless. Yet their spirits never faltered, for they knew where I led, victory often followed. At Ulm, I encircled the Austrian army with a brilliance that shocked even my enemies. Without a great battle, tens of thousands of Austrian soldiers laid down their arms, surrendering in despair. The road to Vienna lay open. But the war was not yet over. From the east, the mighty Russians advanced, their columns stretching across the frozen plains. With them, the remnants of Austria's forces regrouped. Together, they sought to crush me in one great blow. They chose a small town in Moravia, near a hill called Pratzen, as the stage. It was December 2nd, 1805, the first anniversary of my coronation. The morning was cold, mist curling across the fields. My soldiers shivered, their breath rising in silver plumes. But I rode among them, my cloak wrapped tight, my voice calm, steady. Soldiers, I told them, remember this day. It is the anniversary of your emperor's coronation. Show the world that you are worthy of such an occasion. They cheered, even in the frost. And as dawn broke, the sun rose a golden disk, piercing the fog, casting its light upon us. Later they would call it the sun of Austerlitz, as if heaven itself had blessed our arms. The Allies believed me weak. They thought my right flank exposed, vulnerable. Eager to crush it, they poured their forces forward, straining to sweep me aside. But it was a trap. I had drawn them in, lured them like hunters chasing bait. As they descended, they left the heights of the Pratzen Hill unguarded. At that moment, I gave the signal. Marshal Soult's division surged upward, bayonets flashing, drums pounding. They stormed the heights, seizing the very heart of the battlefield. The Allies, caught off guard, staggered. Their lines split, their formations wavered. I watched through my telescope, calm yet exultant. Every move I had envisioned unfolded like the notes of a symphony. On the right, Marshal Davout held firm against overwhelming numbers, his men fighting with iron discipline. In the center, Soult drove forward, cutting the enemy in two. On the left, cavalry thundered across frozen ponds, shattering the foe's retreat. By afternoon, the battlefield was mine. The Russians and Austrians fled in chaos, their banners trampled, their cannons abandoned. The fields lay strewn with their wounded, the ponds broken with the weight of drowned men and horses. When the smoke cleared, victory was absolute. Entire armies had been humbled. The Austrian Emperor Francis sued for peace. Russia retreated in shame. The Third Coalition, once so proud, had collapsed in a single day. As I rode among my men, their faces glowing with pride despite their exhaustion, I raised my hand. "Soldiers," I said softly, "I am proud of you. You have justified all my hopes. On this day, you have won the greatest of victories." They roared in reply, not merely in triumph, but in love. For they knew this was not just my victory, but theirs. The bond between emperor and soldier, already strong, had become unbreakable. Europe, too, felt the shock. Across the courts of Vienna, Berlin, and St. Petersburg, monarchs stared in silence. The myth of invincibility was no longer theirs, it was mine. My empire, still young, had shown its power to the world. The Treaty of Pressburg soon followed. Austria ceded lands, paid indemnities, and withdrew humiliated. The Holy Roman Empire itself, that ancient relic, began to crumble beneath the weight of my victories. A new Europe was taking shape, one where the name Napoleon rang louder than any crown or scepter. That night, as my soldiers camped around their fires, songs rose into the cold air. They toasted their emperor with cups of rough wine, their laughter mingling with the crackle of flames. And I, in my tent, sat quietly for a moment, reflecting. The sun had shone for me at Austerlitz. My star blazed bright across the continent. But as I closed my eyes, I felt no weariness, only the hunger for more. For one victory, however great, was never enough. There were still rivals, still coalitions, still thrones unsteady upon their pedestals. And I, Napoleon Bonaparte, would not rest until all Europe bowed before the Empire of France. The fires of Austerlitz burned low, and with them, so too did the restless energy of my voice. You have walked beside me now from the shores of Corsica to the lecture halls of Paris, through battles of smoke and steel, until the golden sun crowned my destiny at Austerlitz. Perhaps, as I speak, your eyes grow heavy. The rhythm of history has a way of lulling one into dreams, each event like the turning of pages, one after another, until the ink blurs and the story folds into the quiet of night. And I too feel the weight of weariness. Even emperors must sleep. So let us rest here for a moment. Imagine it, the campfires of my armies scattered across a frosted field, the men asleep with muskets stacked and cloaks drawn tight, their breaths rising like mist. The stars above glimmer, silent witnesses to the rise of a new empire. And somewhere in a quiet tent, Napoleon Bonaparte sits, quill in hand, thinking of tomorrow. I do not yet know where the road will lead. I have won, yes, but victory is a strange companion. It feeds the hunger, rather than stills it. I look east to Russia. I look west to Britain. I look within France to the people who call me both savior and tyrant. What path lies ahead? Triumph or tragedy? Tonight I set aside the sword and close my eyes. The world sleeps. Perhaps you do too. And as we drift into the silence together, I leave you with one thought. What is the cost of greatness? Is it measured in battles won, in empires built, or in the sacrifices that linger, long after the drums are silent? I cannot yet answer. Perhaps no man can. But one day the story will return, and we shall walk together again upon the roads of destiny. For now, sleep peacefully. Dream of victories, dream of stars, dream of what tomorrow may bring. The tale of Napoleon is not over. It has only just begun. My friends, my companions through the night, if you are still with me now, then perhaps you are resting upon the edge of slumber. Or perhaps you have already drifted far into dream. But before this first part of our long journey together closes, allow me, Napoleon, to give you my gratitude. You see, the tale of a man's life is not only his own, it becomes alive only when it is heard, when it is carried from one soul to another. I have told you my story from the quiet island of Corsica to the thunder of Austerlitz. Yet what meaning has victory or struggle if there is no one to listen, no one to carry those echoes forward? Tonight, that listener has been you. So I thank you, truly, for walking with me through the cold corridors of Brienne, through the narrow streets of Paris, through the smoky chaos of battlefields where cannons roared and dreams took flight. Your presence, silent though it may seem, has been my companion. And now, as I grow tired, and as perhaps your eyes close against the weight of night, let us linger together a little longer in peace. Let us set down the armor, the strategies, the endless marches of history. Let us simply breathe in the stillness. When I think of the path that has carried me thus far, I see not only the triumphs, but the fragility woven between them. The laughter of a boy in Corsica, the hunger of a student in Paris, the fire of ambition that would not be quenched, all of these moments rest gently now in the hands of memory. Perhaps you too carry your own ambitions, your own quiet dreams, and maybe they burn within you as fiercely as mine once did. If so, I say this: treasure them. Dreams are fragile things. They must be nurtured, protected from the winds of doubt and the storms of failure. Yet it is often in those very storms that their true strength is revealed. Do not fear if the world misunderstands you. Do not fear if the road seems long or the burden heavy. Even an emperor once sat as a boy in the shadows, unsure if his name would ever be known. But for tonight, let us set aside thoughts of destiny, greatness, conquest, empire. All these are for the daylight. Night belongs to gentler things, to the sigh of wind through branches, to the slow rhythm of breathing, to the warmth of blankets drawn close. Greatness can wait. The world can wait. Sleep is its own empire, vast and endless, filled with landscapes no general can command. There, within your dreams, you are the true sovereign. You may walk roads untraveled, speak to those long gone, or simply drift across quiet fields where nothing troubles the horizon. And so I invite you to rest now in that kingdom of sleep. If my words have been your companion, let them fade now into silence. If my story has been your guide, let it dissolve gently into dream. To you, dear listener, whoever you are, wherever you may be, know that I am grateful for your time, your attention, your willingness to share in this long unfolding tale. Time is precious, more precious than crowns or battles. You have given me yours tonight, and for that I bow my head. You have allowed me to speak, not as a distant figure of marble statues in history books, but as a man, vulnerable and weary, eager to tell his story to a friend. I could not ask for a greater gift. And though this chapter closes here, the story does not end. No, it stretches far beyond, across deserts and frozen fields, across crowns and exiles, across glory and ruin alike. You may wonder, what becomes of me when ambition grows too great? What happens when empires clash with the limits of fate itself? Those questions I leave suspended in the air like stars waiting to be named. When you awaken and when the night returns once more, I will be here, and together we shall answer them. But for now, may your sleep be deep, your dreams gentle, and your heart untroubled. May you awaken refreshed, as though you too have crossed the fields of Austerlitz victorious. Close your eyes. Let the weight of the day slip from your shoulders. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to prove. The night asks nothing of you but to rest. If you hear my voice still, let it soften like a candle burning low. If you feel my presence still, Let it be like a cloak wrapped around you against the chill. And so, my friend, I whisper once more, thank you. Thank you for listening, for staying, for dreaming alongside me. As I close this first volume of our tale, I ask you to carry but one thought with you into sleep. What is the true cost of greatness? We shall seek the answer together in the nights to come. Until then, rest well, dream deeply, and know that the story will wait for you.